Okay, we are live with Professor Bruno Drweski, and today we will talk about the Polish United Workers' Party, the PZPR, the party which ruled the Polish People's Republic in Polish People's Republic. So, firstly, Bruno, could you say something about this party, how this party was created, and this because I would like today speak about that you speak more about the crisis of this party after death of Stalin. But before the crisis, could we say something about the origin of this party?
Yes, we have first to know that this party was very young because he was formed in 1948 only, unifying two parties, the Polish Workers' Party, which is the Communist Party, and the Polish Socialist Party, which was a Social Democratic Party. And even the Polish Workers' Party was a very young party because it was a party that was formed in 1942. So we have to understand that Polish communists were very young. Of course, before the war, we had the Communist Party of Poland, but he was dissolved in 1938, and completely new generation of communists emerged during the Second World War. So the communists were a young party, contrary to the socialists, which was a very old party, a party formed at the end of the 19th century. And these two parties mingled in one party. That's very important to understand, that we had an old party and a new party, and of course the new party was more important because at the moment when the two parties reunified, the communist one, the Workers' Party, had about 1 million members, and the Socialist Party had about 500,000 members. But still, we can say that the socialists were quite important in this party because of their experience, because of the traditions, and so on. That's one thing. The second thing we have to take into account, that the communists were not only a young party, but a very young mass party. Because at the end of the war, when the Soviet army arrived in Poland, we had a more or less about 20,000 members of the illegal under Nazi occupation party, Nazi occupation. And at that time, we had 20,000 members, and 4 years later, we had 1 million members. And so we have to understand the fact that this party became a mass party and had not the real time to form new members, to educate them politically, and to begin a real vanguard, let's say, of the working class, that it was supposed to be. Since this party, he was still in a phase, in a period of construction, and changed quite radically of line, because up to 1948 we had a post-war situation, which was a situation where officially there was no Cold War between West and East, between capitalism and socialism, and officially the party was not formed on strong anti-capitalist trend. Rather, the party was formed under national liberation trend, because it was a party, of course, which led the fight against Nazism, against foreign occupation, and for the reconstruction of the state under, of course, socialist orientation, but still its basic function was the reconstruction of the national state, rather at the beginning than the building of socialism. That's one thing. The second thing is, of course, it's a party which was founded mostly, officially, of course, it was a working class party, but in fact, Poland had a very tiny working class and a very large peasant population. So it was rather a mass party of peasants or former peasants, quite often of peasants becoming workers because migrating to cities and working in factories, but still it was a party with very strong peasant influence. I would say petty paysan influence, or even I would say a petty bourgeois influence. All that explains what was the characteristic of the party. And suddenly, let's say in 1948, we had two processes. One was the mingling of Polish Workers' Party and Polish Socialist Party. In the same time, the Cold War burst, and we can say that the Stalin line was much more officially adopted than earlier. So we had this paradoxical situation that a party having quite a lot of people coming from the Socialist Party in the same time adopted a more radical way of behavior, of formation of members, of ideology, and so on. And this situation is, of course, quite paradoxical, and it explains why the grassroots, let's say, member of the party had to study a new line in a very, very quick way. And as we know, things that are done very quickly are not most of the time very solid. But still, of course, this party built the base of socialism, the base of industrialization, of planification, of new regime, but in a very let's say in a hurry situation. And in this situation, this party was under pressure from 1953. The year, of course, with the death of Stalin, but of course, but a year which is important for the communist, the international communist movement, but which is also quite important in Poland because of the tension we began to have inside the Polish society.
I can say that the history of the unification of the Polish Workers' Party, it is also history of my family, that I have two grandparents. One grandparent, the father of my father, his name was Andrzej Nowicki, and this family, the family of my father, was the family of the members of the Polish Socialist Party for very long time. The most important member was Marian Nowicki, who was the member of the parliament. He participated in the Russian Revolution in 1917, and also Marian Nowicki and other Nowickis in Warsaw, they were active in the movement to building the workers' houses, spółdzielnie robotnicze. And in this workers, in this WSM Żoliborz. And there was cooperation between Marian Nowicki and Bierut, who also was in this WSM Żoliborz.
But as a communist.
Yes. But so my grandfather, one grandfather came from the Polish Socialist Party, and he was active. My grandfather, he was born in 1918. So he starting to be a member of the youth organization of PPS before Second World War. It was named Spartacus or something like this. And my other grandfather, he wasn't politically involved. He was very young, and he was sending to the Auschwitz. And after he was sending to the Germany. It was one of these. I forgot the name. Buchenwald.
Buchenwald, yeah.
Yes. In Buchenwald was very strong community of the communists. It was the there was the communists from Germany, but communists from all the Eastern Europe. And in Buchenwald, he started to be a member of Polish Workers' Party. And after
inside the camp.
Yes.
Inside the camp, of course.
And when the war is finished, he stayed in Eastern Germany a half year to help the Polish people came back to Poland with the papers, all these things, because it was very complicated, because there are also the Polish people who are living, not the borders are changed. So it was complicated situation. Many people didn't speak German, and after this he was he started to make he make his studies in Moscow with two members of this family. So it was he and two sisters, two sisters. All three are going to Moscow, and in Moscow they started to be educated Marxist-Leninists after he came back to Warsaw, and he was the teacher of the Marxism-Leninism. It is the history how he became how he met his wife, my grandmother. That my grandmother was not communist; he was a student. But it was obligatory for all the students have the lessons of the Marxism-Leninism, and he was her teacher. So, so you know, I have one grandfather from PPR and other grandfather from PPS, and this is how the Nowicki family was created.
Yeah. So what now?
So what now? So now. Can we say something about the situation in the Polish Workers' Party after of death of Stalin?
Yeah,
if something changed.
Yeah, earlier we have to understand one thing, because the death of Stalin will arrive at the end of this process. So we have a situation already in crisis in Poland, which is not the case in Soviet Union at that moment, but which is the case in Poland. So first of all, we have to understand that basically before the war, there were two main reasons why you could become communist. One reason was let's say the traditional one was the class reason. Mostly workers, not only, but also, of course, mostly workers were coming to the Communist Party because of class struggle and because of class situation. And they decided to join the communists because they understood that only a radical revolution can change things. That's the normal way people went to inside communism in Poland, as in every country of the world. But in Poland, there was also another situation. We have to remember that about 1/3 of the population were national minorities. And especially in cities, Jewish national minorities, and that Poland was under the interwar period under the threat of Polish chauvinism, Polish nationalism, Polish extreme right movements, which were in opposition toward the former Polish government. But inside Polish government also, we had a strong let's say, trends which were ultra-nationalist and even anti-Semitic. Even if we cannot say that Piłsudski was for sure not an anti-Semite, but there were anti-Semitic trends within the let's say the government organizations, and because of this situation, quite a lot of people from national minority origin, and especially from Jewish origin, joined the party, not belonging to the working class. It was rather people from what we can say middle classes, intellectuals, petit bourgeois, little shopkeepers, and so on, which joined, let's say, the socialist revolution program, because, of course, as you know, communism is internationalistic, and they choose to be communist to fight for a new Poland, which would be a Poland where the social reasons, the class reason of racism and anti-Semitism do not exist. But basically, those people had no real class backgrounds. They were mostly joining an internationalist party, and that's quite important to understand, because if you joined a party because of anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean you are really engaged in class struggle. You are rather engaged in the creation of a new internationalistic Poland, which is, of course, a very good thing, but on different base. And of course, if you join party for this reason, your main attention is going in the direction of anti-racism, rather than working class struggle, which is, of course, different of people of working class background who are fighting mostly for a classless society. And this, of course, there was no problem with that before the war. There was no problem with that during the Second World War. But after the Second World War, it happened to be quite important. First of all, because for a quite short time, but for a quite short time, Poland, as most new socialist countries, supported the creation of the State of Israel. And in Poland, even if there were quite few Jews left after the Holocaust of the Second World War, there were still 250,000 Jews at the end of the war, and the Jewish community was divided between pro-Zionists and anti-Zionists. And even at the top level of the Polish United Workers, you find this situation to a certain level, because, for example, the future leader of the Polish United Worker Party in charge of security question, Jakub Berman, had a brother, which was in the same time Adolf Berman, which was in charge of a Zionist, left Zionist, but still Zionist organization. So inside the family of top leaders, you had one leftist Zionist and one communist. And we have, of course, to understand that. And the situation, of course, became much more tense after 1949, when Soviet Union changed trend and discovered that the State of Israel was not going in the direction of anti-imperialism, anti-British, anti-US imperialism, but was standing on the side of Western imperialism, and especially US imperialism. And when it became clear that the State of Israel become reactionary, in the same time, Arab states, which were very reactionary, mostly monarchies, became republic and more left-oriented republic. Of course, there was a change, and then people from Jewish origin in Poland, in all socialist countries, but in Poland, had were in front of a situation where some of them who were on the side of Israel and who were, let's say, sure that the creation of Israel changed things for Jews. Since up to the creation of Israel, a lot of Jews thought that the Zionist idea was a pure fantasy, was not realistic. But after the creation of Israel, it appeared that it was very realistic. So some Jews became to hesitate between, let's say, Poland and Israel. But this didn't appear too strongly at the beginning of the 50s, but later on it will be more and more tense on that field. So that's one thing. The second thing is that of course the main enemy of socialism in Poland was not Zionism. Of course, it was rather Polish nationalism, which was still very strong after the Second World War, and this nationalism was fought by two means. Of course, by the mean of political repression, and also by the mean of trying to build a people's Poland which would appear to the Polish society as a true national and independent country. And of course, this explains why, for example, there was the split between Gomułka and Bierut, because Gomułka was advocating the theory that the Polish United Workers' Party should take into account the national feeling of the masses, even to a certain extent the religious feelings of the masses, and show that the People's Poland is a real Polish national state, a real state defending the nation. And to a certain extent, of course, we can say that this orientation was rather, to a certain extent, nationalistic. Of course, not in the extreme right way, but still, to a certain extent, we can consider it was rather nationalistic. And on the other side, we had people who joined the communism for internationalistic reason, and which were convinced that nationalism is one of the main enemy of socialism, if not the main enemy of socialism. And at the beginning of the Cold War, it appeared, of course, from the Soviet point of view, that the more Poland would be internationalistically oriented, the more Poland will be linked with the socialist camp, and that's why Soviet pressures in Poland went rather toward this group of people fighting strongly fighting Polish nationalism, and especially, of course, some of them were from Jewish origin. And this trend was very strong within the direction of the party up to, let's say, 1952, 1953. And at that moment, a situation did change, especially in Soviet Union, because Soviet leadership discovered that under the cover of, let's say, very strong internationalistic principles, you had some people, especially from Jewish origin, which were in fact quite, let's say, tolerant toward Zionism, This happened in Soviet Union, of course, but it had consequences in Poland because at the top leadership of the party, they discovered, of course, that in Moscow there were quite strong tensions between party members and the highest hierarchy of the party members, and this explained why one of the Jewish, let's say, top officer of the state security, Józef Światło, decided to leave the socialist camp and to take political asylum in the West. And this had consequences, since the American took him to Munich and to the so-called Free Europe radio, where he made quite a lot of intervention about his life, let's say, at the security ministry, and especially criticizing the method used in the state security ministry. He told about torture, about repressions, and so on, which was, of course, rather strange, coming from a man which was a top man at that ministry, and criticizing the way the ministry did function, as if he was not a member of that whole process. But anyway, the fact that he intervened in Free Europe Radio and began to teach, let's say, his point of views, created within the Polish society, but especially at the top leadership of the party, a situation of tension, because some people had the impression that the Polish state was a very repressive Polish state, that the state security was torturing, that the state security was becoming an instrument of dictatorship, which was partly true in a certain way, but it's another question how it did happen and so on. And in this situation, let's say, the top leadership of the party was quite divided. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in 1955, the top leadership of the party get informed about the difficult situation on the economic front, because the 6-year plan was achieving, and it, of course, this 6-year plan managed to create the base of Polish industrialization. That's without doubt. Up to today, we can say that all the Polish economy is structured on the basis which were created during the 6-year plan of 1949 up to 1955. But still, this plan had some wrong things, since this plan was created with the aim of reconstructing Poland, constructing the base of heavy industry, but in the same time, it was supposed to create the basis of let's say, a better consumption situation. But the 6-year plan had to be changed because of the Cold War, and quite a lot of investment previously engaged in the consumption sector, especially in the textile sector, were directed to the armament sector. And of course, because of that, at the end of in 1955, it appeared that the consumption situation didn't improve as it was earlier planned. So there was quite a lot of miscontent in Poland, because the everyday situation of the population was worse than planned. Of course, there were also a situation where the petty peasants didn't want to join collective farm and began to produce food and to sell it on the black market. And all that disorganized to a certain part, disorganized the economy. So in 1955, the party leadership decided that there are wrongdoings in the economy, and that the best solution is to ask people on the grassroots, to look what is going bad in their own factories, in their own villages. And of course, it was the mission party member received, basically in all basic structure of the party. The militants had to study what was wrong going in their environment, and what has to be changed. And this created a huge movement, because a lot of party members took this very seriously, and began to analyze what is going wrong in their factory, what reserve are not used, what potentials are ignored by the administration, and so on. And it was joined with a very active participation, of course, also of journalists. The press in 1955 was very strongly engaged in articles criticizing this factory, this director, this misfunctionment, and we had then in 1955 a very strong criticism of the method used during the 6-year plan. We have also another event which was quite important in 1955. It is the International Festival of Youth, which was in Warsaw. And for young Polish militants, especially from the militants of the Polish Youth Union, the party-linked youth organization, this event was very important, because you had young communists, of course, coming from socialist countries, but you had a lot of young communists coming from Western countries or third world countries even, and young Polish militants discovered that in different countries you can behave differently concerning communism, that French communists are not behaving the same way as Soviet communists, and so on, because of cultural tradition, because of local political situation. And we had a lot of discussion, what is socialism, what's socialism supposed to be, and there was a big turmoil at the end of 1955 about the question what socialism should look like. Of course, all what I'm telling now is very important. It's very important to remember that basically there was no anti-socialist trend. Of course, there were in Poland anti-socialist trends, but they were, let's say, more or less linked with the church or former reactionary movement and leaders. But what I'm talking about are criticism coming from inside, let's say, the socialist-oriented camp. And the discussion was not against socialism. The discussion was how to manage socialism to make it better. But then it created different trends from the, let's say, the most let's say traditional one, let's say Stalin-oriented one, and more or less, even if the word was still not used, revisionistic ones. And this is the situation we had at the end of 1955. And in this situation, the the events in Soviet Union were very important because, of course, Stalin died, as you know, in 1953. But at the very beginning, after his life, the situation didn't really change, apparently. Of course, now we know much more about that, and we know that between 1953 and 1956, within the Soviet Party leadership, quite a lot of tension did appear, but publicly it was not really observed up to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in Soviet Union, and then a situation appeared very clearly. All what I said earlier is was, of course, under the impression that all this discussion, this debate, these tensions were all within, of course, the frame of socialism, and they were within the frame of officially a socialism which was, let's say, marked by the personality of Stalin, the ideology of Stalin, the works of Stalin, and of course the situation changed dramatically in 1956 because, of course, all the critics I told about earlier were critics within socialism, but of course I would even say that these critics were within the frame of Stalinism. If this word is good, according to me, it's not a good word, but anyway, they were within the frame that Stalin was the hero of the proletariat, and that if we have to criticize this or that within socialism, we have to do it respecting the memory and the works of Comrade Stalin. And of course, this changed in 1956. Because when
but wait. Before we started to speak about 1956, what do you think about the thesis that the revisionism in the socialist camp is not started by Khrushchev, but is starting in Poland before? And could you say something about the discussion about the liquidation of the Communist Party of Poland? And what was the attitude of the members of the PZPR towards Stalin before 1956? That it was possible to criticize Stalin before 1956 in Poland?
Not really. I mean, what you are talking about, the idea that anti-Stalinism began in Poland is not, of course, entirely true, because anti-Stalinism was strong inside the higher level of Soviet Party at the time, but it was not visible. And that's, of course, the main difference, that the tension we had in Soviet Union were at the higher level and were not perceived by, let's say, grassroots people. In Poland, the differences is that most of the tensions appeared publicly, but even if they appeared publicly, they didn't really took let's say strong and clear anti-Stalin appearance up to 1956. Of course, there were such issues as the one you mentioned, especially the question of Polish Communist Party before the war. But these questions were debated to a certain extent, not mingling, let's say, Stalin with that. The question where was the dissolution of the Communist Party of Poland a good or a bad decision? Was there then some provocations? But even if it helped later to create some anti-Stalin feelings, At that moment, it was not really clear, because let's say Polish party members were still educated under the impression that Stalin was one of the main Marxist-Leninist thinker, and that if there were some mistakes in Soviet Union or in People's Poland, it is the fault of, let's say, local functionaries, and especially local Polish functionaries. The idea that all the system has to be criticized was still not very in the mood. So we cannot, of course, it happened that, let's say, unconsciously or more or less subconsciously, trends which tended to relativize the personality of Stalin appeared, but not so clearly as later, because we have to understand one thing. It is that the main elements of this discussion I told you about, of debate, of tensions, were mostly visible among the young generations, among the Union of Polish Youth I told about. In factories, it was rather young workers which were very active in all the process I told you about. And this young generation was very strongly under the influence of, let's say, the cult of Stalin. Because from the very beginning of People's Poland, the Polish party direction decided that the young generation is the most important part of the society, because the rest of society is still under some influences from capitalism, from pre-war Poland, from traditionalism, and so on, and that the main target, let's say, of the political propaganda and the education has to be directed toward young generation. And that's why, let's say, in the mid-50s, Polish young were much more Stalinist than, let's say, the average Polish society. And this creates the situation that all this debate couldn't really function among young people on the issues Stalin or not Stalin, because they were all at the beginning, at least, Stalin oriented, and they didn't really know what happened before the war. So of course they heard that the Polish Communist Party before the war was dissolved, but for them it was an old history. It was not a so important history that for the earlier generation of communists, for example. And for them, the basic situation was the war situation and post-war situation, because, of course, they began politically active either during the Nazi occupation or just after the Nazi occupation. And the pre-war period was not for them very important. They were looking to the future. They were not looking so strongly in the past. So all the question we will have later in Poland about Communist Party in the pre-war period, about Katyn, about all these events of pre-war period and war period, were not so important for young people at the moment I'm talking about. They begin much more important later, but not at that moment. So we cannot tell that there was a strong tensions about the Stalin question up to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, even if, as you told, Poland was for sure the socialist country where the political tensions and debates were the strongest. Even if up to 1956, we have to remember that Poland was not the place where you had social tensions, as we had in East Germany, because in East Germany we had the riots in 1953 in Berlin, but we had nothing like that in Poland up to 1956. So it's also quite important to take that into account, because it shows that political tension and social tension in Poland appeared after the 20th Congress of the Soviet Party and not before. We had tensions, but not social tension and social unrest as we had in 1956.
Okay, I will say something about this radicalization of the Polish youth. One more time, I will speak about my grandfather. That my mother was born in November 1956, and my grandfather decided that she will not be baptized.
Yeah,
and but he was very active in the communist movement, and he was working in Warsaw, and my grandmother stayed in Lublin. And one time he come back, and the mother of my grandmother announced that my mother was baptized.
Without the knowledge of the
father. Without knowledge, but it was against his will, because he decided so he broke they moved to Warsaw. What was the problem with they don't speak with this grandmother.
There was a basic family quarrel.
Yes. And after it was a second child, he was not baptized, and all this leave of my mother and my uncle, and they never go to church, and my mother didn't knew that she was baptized.
Even
yes, she didn't knew, because it was something that she was baptized, but never go to church. She was very, and in 1990s, when my mother started to be famous for her anti-clerical activity in the feminist movement, the Catholic press show that she was baptized. She was the member. She is a member.
A member of the church.
Yes, and it is how my mother asked question of grandmother, how it is possible. I have never been in church, and they said that I am baptized, and so how they and after 10 years is it was the time that my mother wanted to go out from the church. But it's 10 years to
take this decision.
Yes.
Formally be.
Yes. She write a letter to the archbishop, and they say later, and it's very, very long time that.
Okay. So now she is officially not Catholic.
Yes,
but
all her life she was in statistic that she was Catholic.
Under People's Poland, she was Catholic, and
yes,
not Catholic in Catholic Poland.
Yes, but she didn't hear about it, and it is how. But here we see all this difference between the generation, that you have young communists who came out from the Buchenwald and after go to Moscow, and he wants to change the Polish society in the atheist socialist society. And my grandmother was ancient Catholic reaction.
Traditional,
traditional. Yes. So now we have 1956. The President Bierut go to Moscow, and it is the second Polish president who died in Russia. We have the President Bierut and also Lech Kaczynski.
But it's quite different.
Yeah, it is, but in Poland they speak all the time that it was only one president who died in Russia, and they forget about Bolesław Bierut. That Bolesław Bierut also died in Russia.
Yeah, but he was not formally president. I think he was the
no, president of the Polish.
Yeah,
he was.
But at that time there was he was president of the Republic of Poland up to 1952. But 1952 we had the Constitution of Polish People's Republic, and there was not anymore president. There was only the president of the State Council, and I even don't know if Bierut was president of the State Council. After the People's Republic Constitution, because of course what we know and what was important that he was the first secretary of the party, but I don't know if he was the president of the State Council. But anyway, it was not the title of President of Republic. It was the status of President of State Council. So formally, they are right when they say that Kaczynski is the only President of Republic who died in Russia. Because Bierut was not the President of Republic anymore, because the institution of the Presidency of Republic was suppressed in 1952.
I didn't. I thought that they changed this after the death of Bierut.
No. They changed it with the new constitution. The new constitution eliminated the title of President of Republic.
And but the name of
the state leader.
Wait. But the name Polish People's Republic, it's come from the constitution, yes?
No, in 1952, yes.
And in 1948, what was the name of Poland?
He was the president of the republic, because at that time it was the March 1921 constitution. And then he was, of course, according to the March 1921 constitution, from 1945 up to 1952, he was the president of republic, according to that constitution.
Okay, he went to Moscow. He listened the speech of Khrushchev, and he had a heart attack, and he died. He was the victim, one of the victims of Khrushchev. We can say.
Yes, of course, indirectly. He didn't die in one day, because he stayed in Moscow for curation, and this curation didn't work, and at the end he died. Of course, because of that, there were legends, myths that he was killed by the Soviet Khrushchev leadership. But most obviously, he really was shocked by this report of Khrushchev, which to a certain extent give him the impression that he was working within a system he couldn't approve. Because what I told earlier about the Światło case, the man who fled in the West and began to talk in a Radio Free Europe, it led the Polish party leadership, and especially Bierut, to change let's say the direction and the policies of the state security, because to a certain extent, even if they knew that Światło was a traitor, they tried to find out what was going wrong within the state security ministry, and they changed all that. They changed quite a lot, thinking to a certain extent, I would suppose, but of course it's supposition, that these problems were strictly Polish ones. But when the Khrushchev report, we know now quite a lot of this report is not true, but anyway, when the Khrushchev report happened in 1956, Bierut was under the impression that it was the whole system, not only the Polish ones, but the Soviet ones, which was corrupt. And it can explain why he was so shocked that he was functioning among a system which is much more criminal that he thought. Of course, I think that it's much more complicated than that. But we have also to take into account the situation of a man leading a country who is confident in the Soviet leadership. So he is confident automatically to the Khrushchev leadership. And then Khrushchev arrives and tells people what you believed in is all false. It was all criminal. And I'm telling you that it's criminal. The contradiction between the Stalin image and the Soviet party image was so strong because the party was right, the party was with Stalin, and the party is still right, and the party is against Stalin. So this contradiction couldn't be, let's say, very clearly managed at that time. Now we have distance. Now we can think about the struggles within the party, the social struggle within socialism, and all the class backgrounds of those contradictions. But at that time, it was very difficult to imagine that, and we have then to take into account that for Bierut it was a very big shock, and it can explain why he had a heart attack. But to a certain extent, it shows how these people were honest, because quite a lot of time they told us in Western propaganda that all communist leadership were cynical people, destroying their country, wanting power for power in an egoistic way, and so on. But it's much more complicated than that, because if they were cynical, as it is said by the Western propaganda, if they were a bunch of, let's say, gangsters leading their countries for their own interest, they would not be shocked by such tensions like the Khrushchev report. They were shocked because they were really believing in what they were doing, and they discovered that something was wrong. And it shows that these people were really politically engaged, really politically sure that they are working for the interest of the masses of the people, and that they are creating a new world, a fair new world, and so on and so on. So this events, like also the fact that in 1953 Gottwald died after the Stalin death, and different elements like that, shows us that a large part, at least, of the Communist Party direction was people which were authentically engaged in a process of socialist revolution, believing in that. And the question is not the morality of these people. The question is rather the morality of people who, in one day, like Khrushchev, decided to burn everything they were celebrating earlier. If we have some cynicism to take into account, the cynicism is not on the side of Bierut, Gottwald, and so on, whatever we think about them, but rather the cynicism is on the side of Khrushchev, Malenkov, and so on, which used the Stalin cult, let's say, to get into power and betrayed him just after he was dead.
Okay, so after death of Bierut, what was the most important person in the Polish Workers' Party, United Workers' Party?
It's difficult to say because at that time, because of all what I said, because we had strong tensions inside the party, because of course there was the question of a new leadership. That's one question, but of course, in the same time, we had the question: what is the party? What is the party line? What is Marxism and Leninism about? And so on and so on. So we had a political, let's say, strictly Polish contradiction, and we had an ideological contradiction we found everywhere in the socialist camp, and this led to the tensions between, let's say, more or less two wings of the party. I say more or less two wings because it appeared, of course, in the Central Committee that we had two wings. But I would say that the mass of the party was not concerned so strictly with these two wings. So anyway, they decided, because of these two wings, I will talk about them later, but anyway, because of these two wings, they decided to find a, let's say, a candidate of compromise, which was Edward Ochab. Edward Ochab was a man which had some qualities which made him to be elected first secretary. He will not be very strong, very long first secretary, because he will be first secretary from the death of Bierut up to October 1956. So more or less he will be first secretary half a year. It's a quite short time, but it's a very tense time. And why he was elected? He was elected because he was a compromise candidate. Because on one side, he was a communist who was in Soviet Union during the Second World War. And I told earlier that there were some, let's say, I don't know if we can say tensions, but there were some differences at the end of the war between the communists who spent war in the underground movement in Poland, and who carried on the fight under illegal conspiracy conditions, and the communists who were in Soviet Union, who retreated with the Soviet army up to Moscow and different cities of Soviet Union, inside Soviet Union, and who didn't experience the Nazi occupation. So after the war, there was some let's say differences between the ones coming from Moscow or from Soviet Union and the ones coming from the underground movement. And Ochab at the time of the Second World War was in Soviet Union. That's one thing, and because of that, he could be considered as the man who has the confidence of the Soviet leadership, and who is linked with communists, let's say, who were the most linked with Soviet leadership at the Stalin time in the same time. But on the other side, he was known as a rather independent thinking man, as a man who is aware that being in Soviet Union during the Second World War made them not understand the evolution of the Polish society during the Second World War in Poland. And because of that, he was also considered as the man who is the only one, let's say, coming from Moscow that can understand Polish communists who were in Poland during the occupation. That's one thing. The second thing, He was not from Jewish origin, but he was very linked with people from Jewish origin. So in a certain stance, he was a compromise man between the two wings that appeared in 1956, and that to a certain extent, not only of course, but to a certain extent, can be described as the internationalistic, to a certain extent, Jewish-oriented direction of the party, and the, let's say, working class backgrounds on the other side. So Ohab was the man in the middle of all that. He was understanding all these situations, and he was linked with all these people from these two main wings. And that's, of course, very important, because as I told you, the differences between the two reasons why you became communist in Poland were not so important up to the beginning of the Stalin era. But at the beginning of the Stalin era, then it began important, because of the situation, who is the main enemy of socialism in Poland? Is it the Polish nationalism, or is it the class questions that has to be solved with the elimination of former leading classes? And this created the split, who happened at the end of who happened in fact in 1956. In 1956 we had two groups, the so-called Puławy group and the so-called Natolin group. These names are just taking their origin from the place where they met. Some leaders met at the Puławy Street in Warsaw, and they were called Puławy Group, and other met in the little palace in the suburb of Warsaw in Natolin, and they were called Natolin Group. Of course, it was informal reunions of party leaders divided on political ground. The Puławy Group was in fact mostly formed of people who were very active in the central leadership of the party during the Stalin era, but who were in favor of basic change. We can say that to a certain extent the Puławy group was the former ultra-Stalinist people who became anti-Stalinist during the 1956 period, and it is linked also with the fact that this was the group of people who joined the party, who joined communism because of internationalism, anti-nationalism, and since in 1956 they discovered that inside the party and inside the Soviet party there was something they felt as anti-Semitism. Of course, it's a very difficult question. It's another subject, and we will not talk about it now. But more or less, the impression was among those people that anti-Semitism didn't disappear with socialism, and that anti-Semitism didn't disappear during Stalin times. They began to be, let's say, the leading force of what will be named later revisionism. They were in favor of, let's say, liberalization of the party. They were in favor of, let's say, better relation with Western countries. They step by step began to denounce what they were very strongly engaged earlier. They are also called the liberal wing of the party, and quite a lot of them, not of course all of them, but quite a lot of them were from Jewish origin. And that's what created, and this evolution led to the creation of the so-called Natolin group, which was the group against them. This group of people were rather not the highest level of the party direction, rather a little bit lower party direction. It was the function. They were the functionaries of, let's say, regional level of the party. They were, let's say, a second layer of the party, and they were very strictly engaged during the Stalin times in all the political campaign in favor of Stalin, of course, but in favor of repression against people's enemy and so on. And suddenly, their subjective reaction was that suddenly the people they were fighting for, the strict leadership of the party, the Puławy group I told you about, betrayed them because they pushed them in the front lines, and suddenly they changed their mind, and people in the front line felt, let's say, isolated. And this impression, because it was an impression, pushed them to develop the idea that the party line was good, but that the traitors were inside the party, that there were opportunist people inside the party, and especially this was linked with the fact that those people were rather from working class origin, not from intellectual origin, and they felt that they are the real communists, and that all those intellectuals leading the party before were in fact opportunists. And one of the reasons of their opportunism is their supposed, let's say, crypto-Zionism. It means that, in fact, they joined the party because they are Jews. They joined communism because they are Jews. They used communism to promote Jewishness. And now you have the state of Israel. Now you have the United States supporting Israel, and they are looking west and betraying socialism. Of course, what I'm telling now is something very caricatural. It's a little bit more complicated, and it depends of people in this situation. It was not so clear. It is not so clear as I told, but I try to be to make a description, a quick description of this situation. So the Natolin group, I would say, is a group who was strictly Stalinistic, but with some, let's say, anti-Semitic trend. And the Puławy group was rather a revisionist group of people which were the most engaged in favor of Stalin line earlier, and who were much more engaged in the anti-Stalin line after 1956. Of course, when I tell that, I'm telling about the two wings, and in the middle you had maybe the majority of the Central Committee, which was not belonging to these two wings, which was in between, and Ohab was the man of the in between. Of course, this situation within the party has to be, of course, compared with the situation in the whole country, because what I'm talking about, it's something inside the party, and I would say that the big majority of the Polish society and the big majority of party members didn't care about all those fights we had in Warsaw at that time. I would say that even the big majority of the Polish society didn't know that there were such things like the Natolin wings or the Puławy links. But in the same time, we had the social problem I told you about last time, which led to the Poznań unrest in 1956, which led to the seventh plenum of the Central Committee in July 1956, and finally, who led to the eighth plenum of the party in October 1956, when it was decided that Gomułka will take the seat of first secretary. What did Ohab is important, because Ohab is not really well known in Polish history, because he was a man who led the Polish party in a very short moment. But anyway, it was very important because Ohab was aware that the party after the Soviet 20th Congress began to be isolated from the society, and that he has to prepare a situation for the renewal of the party links with the masses. He was aware of that. He was also aware that there should be a man that can represent a new line that can be trusted by a large part of the Polish society. He was a realistic man. He was knowing that a large part of the Polish society, especially, of course, the older generation, are not communists. And they don't care about communism, that they are happy with the fact that factories are state-owned, that they are happy with the fact that the state has a progressive social policy, but still they are not in favor of basic, let's say, Marxist-Leninist Marxist-Leninist ideology, and they would prefer a regime which will be middle of the road between strict socialism and, let's say, something like a petit bourgeois type of socialism, with a little private property and strong state-owned enterprises and so on. So he knew that, and at that time of crisis, he has to be realistic. Ohab knew also who was Gomułka. Gomułka, who was arrested at the beginning of the 50s and then freed. He knew that he was against Gomułka. He was not a supporter of Gomułka. He knew Gomułka, according to him, Gomułka was rather a right-wing communist, let's say. So Ohab was not in favor of Gomułka, but step by step, he began convinced that even if he is against him, basically for ideological reason, it is the only man that can be trusted by Poles. So he began to be in favor of the integration of Gomułka within the political direction, and step by step he began even convinced that this man has to be the leader of the party in the real situation of socialism in Poland at that time. And that's very important because he prepared step by step this change on the national level, accepting first that the Poznań unrest in June 1956 are not the result of an intervention of Western intelligence service, but that these unrests are caused by deep contradiction within the Polish society, and especially deep contradiction within the Polish working class, in a socialism which didn't function the way it should. That was the decision of the seventh plenum of the party, and he also prepared the changes on the international level, because officially he accepted the thesis of the 20s 20th Congress of the Soviet Party, but in fact he was, let's say, deceived by the new Soviet leadership. He knew that this new Soviet leadership was behaving in a way which is not constructive, and he thought that Polish People's Republic must go to a certain extent its own way, not relying on Soviet advisors anymore, or at least not relying so much on Soviet advisors. So during the time he was at the leadership, he had a lot of links and discussion with communist leaders inside the whole socialist camp. Of course, leader of the parties, of communist parties of surrounding countries, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on. And he, of course, knew that there were tensions all over the socialist camp, especially in Hungary, as we will see later. And the most he developed link, the most he was convinced that the Communist Party, which was the most, let's say, stable and with a strong base inside its people, was the Chinese Communist Party. And he began to develop regular links with Chinese leaders. It began already at the beginning of the 50s, but we can say that under the OHAB administration, the links between Beijing and Warsaw were very tense. A lot of visits happened between the two countries, and this was made because, as we know, the Chinese reaction toward the 20th Congress were very, let's say, cautious. They didn't criticize officially the Khrushchev line, but Chinese Communist Party never accepted the radical criticism of Stalin, as it was done by Khrushchev, and the Chinese Communist Party in the same time began to develop the theory that the Soviet, let's say, system is not a model that should be adopted, let's say, in a general way, that some element of the Soviet system has to be adopted, but not all of them, because the Soviet party is not a holy party, which is always right. It's also a party where there are a lot of failures. And because of that, OHAB prepared, and it's very important, because without that, the changes of October 1956 would not be possible. The very, very good relation Polish party had with Chinese Communist Party in 1956 explains why, when Gomułka was finally elected in October 1956 under the let's say the authority of OHAB, the Chinese communists were convinced by the Polish communists and by OHAB that Gomułka is the good man in this situation, and that he will not betray socialism, that he will not betray the socialist camp and Soviet Union, and that it's the man who will create out of Poland a socialist country which will be sovereign and in the same time belonging to the socialist camp. And that's very important because when now I'm talking about Gomułka, right? Or you have some questions?
I want to say two things. I want to say one thing and one question. I think the question is important. So, firstly, I would like say something not very important, but you say that OHAP is not very known in Poland, and I can say that it's true. That in the 1990s I didn't heard about OHAP.
Even
yes, that I think that everybody in Poland he heard about Gomułka, Bierut, Gierek, Jaruzelski. He can maybe don't know who was this person when they are ruling the country and party, but these four names, Bierut, Gomułka, Gierek, Jaruzelski, everybody knew. OHAP, nobody knew. And now I say that when I have 11 or 12 years, I in my school, my teacher of mathematics was the Zofia OHAP. She was the daughter of OHAP, and I didn't knew
that she was.
I didn't knew that she was the daughter of OHAP, but I didn't knew who was OHAP. So in this time,
I didn't knew that your teacher was the daughter of the leading man of Poland.
yes, but it was in 1990s after counter-revolution. She was old, and I didn't like her. It was the woman. Every time they smoke cigarettes, and she was. I think that she waited to retirement, and she wanted to finish this, but I don't know. I have 10 years old or 11, and after when I started to study history, when I became Marxist. When I heard about OHAP, I started to check because it is not very popular name in Poland. OHAP.
Yeah.
So I checked, and it was you can find photo in internet now. Her with but you can but in this photo she's young and pretty. When she was old and not very. Okay, and now the question, important question about this evolution in the Puławy group from the people which we can say that they are ultra leftist, very radical Stalinists, very radical communists, and few years later they became liberal Marxists, we can say, and many of them 20, 30 years later, they became the anti-communists, the people who prepare counter-revolution. And it is not only the example of Poland, that we have many people who was he was ultra-leftist, and later they started to ultra criticize the Stalinism, or was the people who was the first to make the market reform. So we have example of Tito, that in 1940s he was the more Stalinist than Stalin, and a few years later he became to build the market socialism. But the worst example, it is the people who in 1960s in China made the Cultural Revolution, and 20 years later this is the people who became the Chinese bourgeoisie, that in 1990s when you look to the Chinese bourgeoisie, people who are now 50, 60 years old, you read biography that in 1960s they were active in the Hunwei Bin movement and
the Red Guard.
Red Guards, yes. And also we have examples of the intellectuals in 1960s in the Western imperialist countries,
Yes,
which
of
was
course.
very radical, the Cohn-Bendit, and after they
So-called
are
radicals. Yeah, yeah.
so what can you, how it is, I can say how to ask this question, but the people from intellectual backgrounds
That's the
who
problem.
are
That's
very, very young and very, very radical, 10, 20 years later, they became the opposites of the ideology which they started their political life.
yeah. It's in of course it's an interesting issue. The problem in Poland was that quite a lot of people who criticized them concentrated most often or quite often on their Jewish background. Of course, the Jewish background explains some things, but it doesn't explain everything. Basically, they were not only Jewish background, but they were intellectual backgrounds, and that explains why among those people you have people from Jewish origin, but you have people without Jewish origin, which were in the same group, and all what they have in common is not the Jewishness, is the intellectualism, which and that's quite important, I would say, because of course intelligentsia is a very special social strata in Eastern Europe. It has nothing. It is not really the same we have in Western Europe when we talk about intellectuals. Of course, intellectuals are important in Western Europe, but it's not so important as the so-called intelligentsia in Poland, in Russia, in most of Eastern European countries. Why? Because intelligentsia is a social strata that arrived to the top, let's say, of the society at the end of the 19th century, when Western Europe was strictly capitalist, but Eastern Europe was still semi-feudal. And when in Western Europe, a large part of the elite were going, let's say, the industrial way, to become engineers, to become, of course, bourgeois, to become linked with the industrialization process. In Eastern Europe, the industrialization process was much weaker. So people who were educated couldn't so easily get in the industrial world, in the bourgeois world, and they were rather oriented to intellectual functions, and they began to discuss politics because, of course, they were not in the center of power. They were, to a certain extent, frustrated being near power, but not belonging to the power, because they had no economical basis, as had, let's say, the higher middle class in the Western world, which was linked with industry. And because of that, the intellectuals were let's say, in a miscontent situation, which led them toward revolutionary movement. But of course, their way to revolution was not a working class, grassroots movement. They were, let's say, companions of the working class, but they were not working class. But in the same time, they were belonging to a social strata, which was very very obvious, very important, because it was the social strata able to formalize the social contradictions. In the West, intellectuals are, let's say, servants of the leading classes. In the East, intelligentsia is in between the old feudal leading classes and the new industrial world to which they don't belong. So they had a very strong influence over the society, and especially in Poland, because they could talk in the name of the nation, since the Polish state was not existing. So they were let's say, the consciousness of the nation. And this leading role was for them quite important, even if they had no material base for their let's say intellectual influence. And this situation explained why up to the creation of socialism they were of course left oriented, because they couldn't find their place in a semi-capitalist system, which didn't integrated let's say the intellectual elites inside a stable system, because this capitalism in Eastern Europe was not stable and was not stabilized. So they were anti-capitalist because of that, but they were not anti-capitalist because of class, of profound class collectivism of the working class. They were still, let's say, anti-capitalist individualists, not anti-capitalist class collectivists. And of course, what I'm talking about explain also why you had so many Jews in this movement, because Jews, for historical reason, are people living in towns. So, of course, they were the first on the front line, let's say, of the agony of feudalism, and they were on the front line of the modernity, of the modern trends coming with capitalism. And the difference with the Western world, where Jewish, let's say, bourgeoisie could integrate within the capitalist system, the Jews in Poland, as a middle class, couldn't be integrated in any part of the leading classes, because of course the old feudal class was not their class, and the new bourgeoisie was very weak. So you had some bourgeois in Poland, or in Russia, or in Eastern Europe, but you had no strong bourgeoisie with a strong industrial base. So we had quite a lot, of course, of intellectuals, but especially of Jewish intellectuals, because what they could do, they could do only middle class functions, and they could have intellectual activity because they had no productive activity. They couldn't have most of them couldn't have activity. So this situation created for them a situation which pushed some of them, not all, but quite a lot of them, toward political radicalism. But their political radicalism was an intellectual radicalism. In fact, they were always, to a certain extent, thinking of themselves as the true conscious, the true leading elite of the nation. They had this difference with, let's say, Western European communists, for example. They had this difference that if you choose communism in Western Europe, or if you choose communism in Third World, you choose to be the servant, I would say, of the working class, because you understand that in the class struggle, there are only two basic classes, the working classes and the bourgeoisie, and you stay on the side of the working class because you discovered that the bourgeoisie is not the class you want to identify with. But in Eastern Europe, these petit bourgeois intellectuals had the feelings most of the time that uh, they are on the side of working class, but working class is a lower social strata. They have to, let's say, to enlighten people, that they are the enlightened ones. They are the ones. They are not. They will not learn from workers or peasants. They will learn. They will teach workers and peasants how to be socialist, how to be communist, how to be Marxist, and so on and so on. And this created this ultra leftist reaction in one moment. It means we want to destroy all this old world because this old world has not accepted us inside, but not because this old world is bad, but because they didn't accept us as a leading group. Now inside communism, we are the leading group, so everything is fine. But when this leading group began to be matched by the growing power of real working class, because of course what we have to understand is that socialism was a huge movement of social promotion of people from working class background to the up of the societies. They refrained that movement because, in a certain extent, they understood that their historical role as a leading force, as a leading group, as an enlightened group is finished, because now you have workers that are ready to think about philosophy, that are ready to think about Marxism, that don't need a special middle class intellectuals to think. They are able to think by themselves. So they become step by step useless. They are still at the top of the party, but in fact they can be replaced. They are not anymore the enlightened ones, and so they became, I would say, more and more reactionary, because they began to defend their privilege. Not material privilege, but intellectual privilege, that they are the best ones who understand things better than the working class. So there was a class struggle, I would say, and at that time in socialism, and this political strata, which was ultra leftist at the time, where they wanted to eliminate former leading classes, as soon as they were in leading position, began to defend their own, let's say, social strata statuses against this huge mass of people. Because of course you must understand, as I told you, that the Polish United Workers, it was 1 million members in 1948, and it was almost 1.5 million members in 1956. When you have so many million of people in the party, the tiny group of intellectuals who were leading that party up to that time is not really useful anymore. They can be replaced very quickly, and they were, to a certain extent. So that's the basic reason, because intellectuals are not a social class. Intellectuals have to choose. Either they are on the side of the working class, either they are on the side of the bourgeoisie. But of course, subjectively, most intellectuals like to be the leaders, the moral leaders, let's say, of the population. In the same time, of course, they are very happy if they have material privilege. One can be linked with the second, but basically they are not really linked with the grassroots members of their country. So in 1956, in fact, step by step, it appeared that, at that time capitalism was still developing, and step by step they began to understand that
Socialist.
Pardon?
Socialism.
No, capitalism in the Western world. And they began to understand that, after all, in such a system, the American system, they would be top leaders, and maybe much more stabilized than in a socialist country where you have a lot of working class people promoted by the party structure. And step by step, they begin to find that the Western world would be better for them than the Eastern one, and that's right. In fact, that's what happened, because the change of regime that happened at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, maintained their position of a leading group at the moment where they were less and less important in the socialist structures. So of course, it's an evolution that took years, because you cannot do it in one night. But still, it's the whole question of intellectuals within the working class movement is a very basic question that has been, of course, analyzed by Marxists and so on during the whole 150 years of socialism. But still, it's a question that was not analyzed in a sufficient way.
Shortly, we can say that after revolution, when they still exist, the reactionary intelligentsia from bourgeoisie, the revolutionary intelligentsia, young people, they are revolutionary. But in the time when they take the place, the older intelligentsia, they became the traitors. Yes.
Yeah. Objectively, of course, then we have to look on individual case. But as a group, yes, you are right. That's the point. That's the point. That's very important. The intelligentsia within socialism is a social strata, quite often more and more reactionary.
Okay, so thank you, Bruno. Next weekend we will make video from the May Day demonstration in Paris.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, and what? And after Hungary and other stuff.
Yeah, later on. Okay.